Burnt Ends and Beloved Things. Chapter 1. Before the City Remembers Itself. The oven had its own opinions about time. Lucien Marchand had learned this over 41 years of early mornings, of padding down the narrow stairs. From the apartment above in his wool socks, his knees announcing themselves on each creaking step, like old men at a card table. The stone oven, a great, barrel-chested thing that took up nearly the entire back wall of the bakery, always ran a touch hotter on its left side than its right. No matter what he did to it, no matter what any technician said, Lucien had stopped arguing with it around the time his hair went entirely silver, which was also around the time he stopped arguing with Annalise about which direction to hang the calendar. Some things a man learned to accept. It was 4:30 in the morning when he lit the pilot flame, and outside, the Rue des Acacias was still blue-black and dreaming. Autumn had arrived properly this week. Not the lukewarm, apologetic autumn of recent years, but the real thing, with fog that pooled at the corners of buildings and breath that made small clouds. Through the front window, the street lamp wore a halo of mist. A cat sat beneath it, contemplating something philosophical. Lucien tied on his apron the old canvas, the color of unbleached linen, and began. The first task was always the sourdough. He kept his starter, 40-year-old culture he had inherited from the previous owner, and named, privately, Monsieur Grognon for its tendency to sulk in cold weather in a ceramic crock on the second shelf. He fed it without speaking to it. He was not the sort of man who talked to fermented things, despite what Annalise claimed. "You whisper to it," she had said. Once, appearing in the kitchen doorway in her dressing gown, squinting against the light. "I've heard you." "I was talking to myself. You said there." He had not replied to this. Now, alone in the warm belly of the bakery, with flour rising in small clouds from the marble counter and the oven beginning its low, patient hum, Lucien measured and mixed and folded, with the unhurried rhythm of a man who had done this so many times that his hands were smarter than his brain about it. He didn't need to think. That was the gift of routine. It left the mind free to wander, to notice the particular quality of silence before 5 in the morning, when even the pigeons were still sleeping, and the city existed in its most private form. He was shaping the third boulée when he heard the apartment stairs protest above him. 1 creak. 2. Then the familiar hesitation on the 4th step. Annalise always forgot the 4th step, always thought she'd arrived at the bottom already, always lifted her foot half an inch into the air and then found more step beneath it. The bakery door opened. She appeared in her blue dressing gown, her white hair pinned up with a single tortoise-shell clip that was doing very little to contain it, holding a mug of coffee in both hands. 73 years old and still carrying herself like a woman who had opinions about architecture. "It's cold," she said. "You didn't have to come down. I couldn't sleep." She settled into the tall wooden stool behind the counter, her stool, the one that had been hers since 1987 when she'd found it at the market, and declared it the perfect height for watching her husband work without being in the way. She wrapped both hands around the mug and surveyed the bakery with a proprietorial air. "How is Grognon? Cooperative?" "That means he's not." Lucien turned back to his dough. Behind him, he could hear her breathing, the soft creak of the stool, the occasional sound of her sipping. It was, he thought, as he had thought, approximately 12,000 mornings before this one. A very good sound to have in a room. Chapter 2. Steam and Inventory. By 6 o'clock, the first loaves were in the oven, and Lucien had moved on to the croissants. This was, by general consensus, the most technically demanding part of the morning. The laminating, the folding, the precise cold, resting periods that turned a simple dough into something with 81 distinct shattering layers. Lucien had learned croissants from a pastry chef in Lyon, who had the temperament of a border collie and the vocabulary of a sailor, and the process still required his full attention. He did not speak during croissants. Annalise knew this. She occupied herself by doing what she called inventory, and what Lucien suspected was actually a thorough examination of everything he'd done so far, looking for something to comment on. "You've put too many poppy seeds on the rye again." "The rye isn't in yet." A pause. "I'm speaking prospectively. You cannot do prospective inventory." "I absolutely can." He folded the dough. She drank her coffee. Outside, the fog was beginning to take on the faint, gray quality that preceded dawn. Not light exactly, but the suggestion of light, the city clearing its throat. "Sylvia called yesterday," Annalise said. "I know. I was there. She wants us to come for Christmas." "We said we'd see. We said we'd see 3 years ago as well." Lucien did not look up from the laminating block. "This is still the same we'll see. It's a long we'll see. It encompasses multiple Christmases." Annalise made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood. Their daughter Sylvia, who was 44, and lived in Bordeaux with her husband and 2 teenage children, had inherited Lucien's stubbornness and Annalise's talent for describing it in vivid terms. Holiday negotiations between their family required the patience of a diplomat and the appetite of someone who would receive, regardless of the outcome, very good food. "She says the children miss you," Annalise added. "Tell her to send them here. They can carry things." "They're not draft horses, Lucien." "No, but Chloe is strong. She moved my flour sacks last summer without being asked. She did that so you'd let her eat croissants in the back." "Yes. She's got good instincts, industrial instincts." He turned the dough again. "She'll be a baker." Annalise laughed properly this time, and Lucien permitted himself a small smile toward the marble counter. At 6:15, the first alert from the oven, a subtle shift in its hum, a certain smell, told him the sourdough was approaching its moment. He crossed to the large brass-handled oven door and opened it, letting out a rush of heat that fogged his glasses. The first loaf had gone slightly dark on the left side. Not burnt exactly, but emphatic. Lucien considered it with a baker's clinical eye. The crust was deep mahogany on the left, transitioning to a proper chestnut on the right. The internal structure would be fine. This was purely a cosmetic matter. In terms of flavor, the caramelization on the dark side would be exceptional. He slid his peel under it and lifted it out onto the wooden rack. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it aside on the small shelf beneath the counter, the shelf that held the canvas bag. Chapter 3. Madame Renard and the Question of Character. By 7:30, the bakery was open. The first customer of the day was almost always old Madame Renard from the building across the street, who was 81 and had the energy of a woman half her age and the opinions of 3 women combined. She arrived in her good coat. She always wore her good coat, regardless of the weather, and placed her hands flat on the counter, the way she had been doing since Lucien had bought this bakery decades ago. "Bonjour," she said. "Bonjour, Madame Renard. You've got the good sourdough today. I can smell it from the door. I always have the good sourdough. Some days are better than others. Today is better." She examined the loaves on the wooden shelf behind him with the thoroughness of a customs official. "Give me one." "The one on the right there." Lucien wrapped it in the brown paper and tied it with the white string, the way they'd done it here for 60 years, before he arrived, and would presumably do for 60 years after. Madame Renard watched this process with satisfaction. "And that one?" She pointed to the loaf on the small shelf beneath the counter, the darker one sitting alone in its canvas bag. "That one is not for sale." She raised her eyebrows. They were magnificent eyebrows, expressive as flags. "Not for sale? It looks perfectly good to me. It's a personal loaf." A personal loaf. She rolled this phrase around as though testing its legitimacy. Since when does a baker keep personal loaves? Since always. "I've been coming here for 30 years. I've never noticed a personal loaf." Lucien accepted his change back and handed her the bagged bread. "Perhaps you weren't paying attention." Madame Renard accepted this with the grace of someone who was, in fact, always paying attention, and had therefore noted the personal loaf before, and simply wanted confirmation of it. She tucked the bread under her arm. "Is that for Annalise?" she asked. Lucien looked at her. She smiled a small, satisfied smile and left. The morning rush, such as it was, followed its usual pattern. There was the young man from the architecture firm, 3 streets over, who came every morning for an almond croissant, and was visibly too busy to enjoy it, eating it while looking at his phone. There was the grandmother. Lucien thought of her simply as the grandmother, though she had certainly a name, who bought 2 plain baguettes and the same conversation every Tuesday about the quality of bread in modern supermarkets. There was the rotating cast of tourists, identifiable by the way they photographed the brass cash register, which Lucien had never replaced because he liked it and because it worked perfectly well. There was the man with the enormous dog who always bought pain au raisin, presumably for himself, though the dog looked interested. Annalise came down properly at 8, dressed now, her hair properly pinned, and installed herself behind the register in the way she did every morning, with the air of someone assuming command of a small but well-run territory. She did not need to be here. They had a girl on Wednesdays, a boy on weekends, and on the other mornings they managed between the 2 of them, which was, Lucien had to admit to himself only, mostly Annalise managing and Lucien baking. "You left the dark loaf under the counter again," she said, approximately 7 seconds after taking her position. "Yes." "The small shelf." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. A customer came, bought a ficelle and a tart, left. Annalise gave change from the register with the automatic grace of 40 years of practice. When the door closed again, she said, "You don't have to do that." "I know. I mean," she paused, "every morning, it's a bit much. It's one loaf." "It's one loaf," she agreed, but she said it softly. Chapter 4. What the Oven Keeps. The story of the dark loaf, if one were to tell it properly, began in 1984. They had been married 3 years then, and living in a smaller apartment, above a smaller bakery, in a smaller town, and Lucien had not yet fully understood what he was doing with bread. He understood the mechanics, the chemistry, the timing, the temperatures, but not the spirit of it. He was technically proficient and artistically uncertain, like a man who can copy a painting perfectly but hasn't yet learned to love the subject. That autumn, he had burned a boule badly. Not dark on one side, not emphatic properly burnt, black-bottomed, smelling of failure. He'd been distracted by something, an argument they'd had the night before, something small that he couldn't even remember now, except that it had felt, at 29, enormous and unresolvable. He'd taken the loaf from the oven and been about to throw it in the bin when Annalise had appeared. She was 28 then, and had the same white streak in her dark hair that she'd had since she was 16, premature. Her mother said, distinguished, she said herself, and she'd looked at the burned loaf and picked it up from the rack. "Give it here. It's ruined. It's interesting." She'd turned it over in her hands, examining the burnt underside with what seemed like genuine appreciation. "Look at this color. It's almost purple. It tastes like ash." "Does it?" She'd broken off the edge, the most dramatically burned part, and eaten it. Her expression had passed through several stages. "It tastes like, actually, it tastes like bitterness and caramel simultaneously, like the end of something good." She'd looked at him. "It tastes like honesty." He hadn't known what to do with this at the time. Later, months later, years later, eventually decades later, he understood that what she had meant, or what he had come to believe, she meant, was that the imperfect things carried information that the perfect things didn't. A flawless loaf told you about skill. A slightly ruined one told you about everything else. The morning, the mood, the argument, the distraction, the specific heat of that particular autumn in that particular oven. It told you something true. Annalise had, from that day forward, claimed the mistake pieces, not the disasters. Lucien had gotten competent enough that disasters were rare, but the loaf that went a shade too dark, the croissant with the uneven layers, the baguette that split on the wrong side. These she declared hers by right of philosophy, and he had stopped arguing with her about it around 1991. After that, he had started setting them aside. He was not entirely certain when it had become a ritual, not just here, the imperfect loaf, but the specific shelf, the canvas bag, the not for sale, but somewhere in the long, ordinary, well-lived run of mornings, it had taken on a form. The dark loaf on the shelf was not a statement. It was not romantic exactly, or he didn't mean it to be romantic in any theatrical sense. It was simply an acknowledgement. Every morning contained its burnt piece. Every morning he kept it. Chapter 5. Evening Bread. At 5:30, when the bakery was closed and the chairs were upended on the tables and the flour-dusted counters had been wiped down to their natural paleness again. Annalise sat at the kitchen table upstairs with her reading glasses on and a cup of chamomile tea and the dark loaf on a board in front of her. Lucien was washing up. He could hear her behind him, the sound of the bread breaking, which was always more of a tear than a snap, because sourdough at this time of day had set its crust into something architectural, and then the quiet that meant she was eating. "This one's very good," she said. He didn't turn around. "It's too dark on the left side." "Yes, that's the part I'm eating first." A pause. "You went too hot in the first 20 minutes. "I know. I was thinking about something." "What were you thinking about?" He dried his hands on the dish towel and turned around. She was sitting with her reading glasses, slightly askew, and a piece of bread in one hand, and the sort of expression she had when she was pretending not to be curious, which he had identified and catalogued over 50 years of marriage into its various subcategories. Pretending not to be curious about him, about their daughter, about the neighbors, about books she'd told him she wouldn't read. This was the him variety. "Sylvia's Christmas," he said, and he sat down across from her. "Perhaps we go this year." Annalise looked at him over her glasses. "You said Christmas in Bordeaux gives you the feeling of a man displaced from his proper climate," she said. "I said that 12 years ago. You've said it more recently than 12 years ago." "I may have said it more recently." He pulled a piece of bread from the loaf, not the burnt edge, which was hers, but the interior, where the crumb was open and faintly honeyed and warm, in the way that bread is only warm within hours of baking. He ate it, but Chloe carried my flour sacks. "And the boy, what's his name?" "Annalise, the older one." "Simon?" "Simon. He asked me last summer if sourdough was hard to make." "He asked you because Sylvia told him to show interest in your work." "Yes, but he came back the next day and asked again." "That was his own idea." Lucien considered. "He has questions. He should come spend a week here. Spring, perhaps. Let him ask the questions in the bakery where the answers make sense." Annalise lowered her bread. She was looking at him with the expression he could never entirely catalogue, not because it changed, but because it had too many things in it at once and had for 50 years, and he suspected it always would. "We'll tell Sylvia yes," she said. "About Christmas." "Yes. And yes, about Simon in spring. If he still wants to come, he'll want to come." She broke another piece from the loaf. "He has your kind of wanting, the kind that lasts." Outside, the Rue des Acacias was fully dark by now, and the fog was back, not the thin autumn mist of morning, but the proper October evening version that turned the street lamps into soft gold spheres and made the cobblestones shine. Somewhere down the street, a cafe radio played something slow. A few late pedestrians passed, their footsteps quick and muffled. The kitchen was warm. It smelled of flour and chamomile and the remnant ghost of bread baked 14 hours ago, which was the smell that had soaked into the walls over 4 decades and would probably outlast the building itself. Lucien looked at the loaf between them, more than half gone now, just the right side portion remaining, properly colored, technically superior. "You never eat the good side," he said. "The good side is for customers. It's the same bread." "It isn't," she said, and put her glasses straight. The good side is bread. The other side is information. She picked up her tea. I've always preferred information. He looked at her. Annalise Marchand, at 73, with her white hair, and her tortoise-shell clip, and her chamomile tea, and her reading glasses that were never quite straight. She looked back at him with the expression he couldn't catalogue and didn't try to anymore, because trying implied that eventually you'd finish, and he had decided long ago that he'd rather keep going. Tomorrow, he said, I'll probably burn the left side again. I know, she said. The oven runs hot on that side. It always has. I could get someone to look at it. She raised an eyebrow, one of those expressive, declaratory Annalise eyebrows that had been raised at him for 50 years. Don't you dare. Lucien looked at the dark loaf and at the woman who had claimed every mistake piece since 1984, and felt not happiness, exactly, which was too simple a word for something this quietly enormous, but rather the very specific satisfaction of a man who has, through great good fortune and some small stubbornness, managed to build the exact life he was supposed to be living. He reached over and took the last piece of the burnt edge before she could. She gasped a sound of genuine outrage. That was mine. Information should be shared, he said, and ate it. Annalise Marchand looked at her husband with the expression that had 50 years in it, and laughed and poured herself more tea. Outside, the fog kept its counsel. The street lamp held its gold, and tomorrow morning at 4:30, an old baker in wool socks would descend the stairs, 1 creak, 2 creak, careful on the 4th, and light the oven and begin again.